is a woman by the name of Judge Amy Coney Barrett. She has already been vetted because she actually serves on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. She has already weighed in on 100 different opinions in that regard. She was formerly a professor at Notre Dame, so when I've heard some people say we don't have enough of a record on her, I'm thinking, we have a pretty good record on her, and of course we know a lot more about her, as illustrated by the fact that the number of pro-abortion groups that are just incensed by the possibility that she could be on the court, I think illustrates only so well what everybody knows but nobody will say. And so anyway, that is one of those issues that we will be talking about this week. And if you find yourself saying, well, is this something we should postpone or move ahead on? The first article we have posted is a piece by Kelly Shackelford. You know who Kelly Shackelford is. He joins us most Fridays. And this is a piece that appeared in Newsweek. America can't afford to wait for a new Supreme Court justice, and goes through some of the arguments for that. And that is having to do with the issue of religious liberty, various situations in which you've had various presidents nominate individuals even during an election year. And then, of course, even at the end, makes, I think, one of the more compelling cases that Ted Cruz has made. And that is, if this election, which I just mentioned a minute ago, goes into overtime, and I suspect it is going to now, in light of some of these decisions that have come out of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and a few other places, then I do believe that you don't want this finally resolved, in a sense, not resolved by a court that ends up with a 4-4 tie. And we've had a few of those, especially when Antonin Scalia died unexpectedly. So the case that Kelly makes goes on for pages. Matter of fact, this actually is amazing how lengthy this is. I guess 5 of the 16 pages that I printed out there are just his commentary, and then, of course, all the responses you might imagine to that as well. One other point that I will make before we take a break is the second article we've posted is by Charles Cook. Charlie Cook has written on a variety of things, but I really appreciate what he says here. Court packing is a silly idea, and the Senate knows it. Because one of the arguments being made by the Democrats is, okay, if you go ahead and put your Republican nominee on the court, when Joe Biden becomes the president and when the Senate becomes Democrat, we will then go and pack the court. And he reminds all of us that that is just not going to happen. He says, first of all, the idea that the Democrat Party is going to pack the court is ridiculous. Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, is against such a scheme and is on record explaining why. And even if he were to change his mind under pressure, the political incentives elsewhere simply do not line up. Whom exactly do we imagine is going to vote for this? Joe Manchin, who voted to confirm Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, John Tester, Kyrsten Sinema. Of course, some of those may not end up there, but we'll see. Any meaningful Democratic Senate majority would be built atop victories in Iowa, Arizona, North Carolina. Are these swing staters really going to line up behind this nuclear option during the first year of their new jobs? And he goes on with a lot of other arguments to say that even though you hear this argument that there is going to be an attempt to court pack, of course, one of the other things that Rich Lowry points out is to add a bunch of new seats to the Supreme Court explicitly so a Democratic president could fill them would radically diminish the court's standing, and it would invite, he says, Republicans to counter with their own bout of court packing when they again return to power, which I would hasten to argue against. But it just illustrates, again, that it's a threat, but it's a little more of an idle threat. Even though the Speaker of the House said that we've got a lot of arrows in the quiver, and I love the illustration, the metaphor, since I love archery, but I'm not sure how many arrows are in that quiver. But when we come back, we can maybe get into that in a little more detail. But before we do, the governor has been essentially censured by the Republican Party. The inscrutable wisdom of the Dallas ISD wants to spend $3 billion. And there's a controversy there in Houston, Texas. So we'll talk about all that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program recently, one of my guests mentioned that it is nearly always assumed that any racial disparities are due to racism. When there is a significant difference between black and white citizens, certainly racial prejudice or discrimination should be considered, but it shouldn't always be the assumed conclusion. Mario Loyola believes that we can find other explanations. For example, according to reports from the New York Police Department, black men are arrested and prosecuted in about 60 to 70% of every category of violent crime, though they are just over 10% of the city's population. He then points out that there is a major disparity, and that is due to the disproportionate number of 911 calls from black neighborhoods. Now, I suppose you could argue that if you want fewer cops in black neighborhoods, then the citizens should make fewer 911 calls. Those calls to police are for help dealing with crimes that are occurring in that neighborhood. Another disparity can be found in the prisons. More than 5% of black males are in prison at any given time. This is 5 times the incarceration rate of whites. Yet again, if we look at New York City, we discover that criminal suspects in the city are disproportionately black, since most of the victims of crime in the city are black. These two examples aren't meant to say that all racial disparities can be explained away. My point is to briefly illustrate why we shouldn't immediately assume that any significant difference in statistics between races is due to racial prejudice or some form of discrimination. If we are to truly address issues of race in society and remedy true discrimination, we would be better served not to jump to such conclusions. Sometimes there are other reasonable explanations for such disparities. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few minutes, let's give you some news from the state of Texas. I recognize some of you listening are not in the state of Texas, but you can learn from a few of these arguments, so we're only going to focus a little time and attention on that, but this is one of those hours in which the vast majority of people listening during this 12 to 1 o'clock hour are from the state of Texas, and so that is relevant. Let me, as a program note, also mention that next hour we're going to have Natasha Crain with us. We're going to be talking about her book, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. She also does these blogs, and I might just mention, as we are going to be talking about this with her, one that came out, How to Explain to Your Kids Why Social Justice Warriors Hate Christians So Much. And then one came out a number of months ago, 5 Ways Christians Are Getting Swept into a Secular Worldview in This Cultural Moment. So she has done a great job of not only helping us know how to educate our kids, but also helping us think through some of these worldview issues. But let's talk about the state of Texas for just a minute, because Governor Abbott, a Republican governor, has now been criticized strongly by his fellow Republicans. There is a resolution that was just passed which has the title, No Exceptions, No Delays, Open Texas Now. And this is what many people have called a call to action. It's a resolution that was passed almost unanimously by the Republican Party of Texas Executive Committee. And that is urging the governor, Greg Abbott, to immediately rescind all COVID-related mandates, closures, and restrictions and reopen the state. Now, to understand this, you have to recognize that what we have in the state of Texas, and I'll use the Republican Party, but the Democrat Party has something similar, is that in each one of the 31 state Senate districts, you have a executive committee member, a male and a female. So if you can do the math, you can figure out that that's 31 times 2, so there's 62. And as a result, these are the individuals that oftentimes go to Austin, gather information, and bring it back to the local areas, many times the particular county. In the case of West Texas, many counties, and they then pass that information on. And they are part of the executive committee. These are individuals that you would expect to be very favorable to a Republican governor. So I think it illustrates only so well the growing tension between the governor and a fairly significant number of people that have positions in the Republican Party. This was actually put together by a man by the name of Rolando Garcia, who is a newly elected committeeman from the Senate District 15, which is in Houston. And the resolution is entitled Open Texas Now. And it was motivated in large part by the decision that we announced even on the air when we had State Senator Angela Paxton on, that Governor Abbott was actually going to then allow businesses to open at 75% capacity. Well, still, others remained closed. A lot of those were bars and other situations as well. And so anyway, the resolution put forward in the committee meeting, this one taking place in Houston, had 54 members in favor of it and only 4 voting against it. That, of course, would be 58. I assume a couple of the executive members could not attend. And then Rolando Garcia even went on to say that if we were voting based on what we hear from the grassroots, it would have passed with every single vote. But the point is this is pretty overwhelming from individuals in positions of some authority in the Republican Party. Fortunately, of course, this governor is not running for re-election. There are 13 governor's races around the country, but Texas is not one of those. But it does illustrate that maybe 2 years from now, there may still be some real concerns about that. And so I thought I would point that out because you probably will occasionally see it in the press, but it was pretty significant and worthy of mention. We broadcast in the Dallas area, and this one is really a little bit of a head shaker. You've got to say, okay, we have been through a pandemic. We have been through an economic downturn, partially because of the pandemic, and especially, in light of what we just said, because of the lockdown. So you would think that this would be probably the worst time to talk about bond proposals, probably the worst time of all to talk about tax increases. And if you thought that, you would be wrong. Because now the Dallas Independent School District is proposing a $3.7 billion, that's with a B, $3.7 billion. I guess the actual number is 694,000, but what's, a few hundred million amongst friends, but my goodness. And this is a proposal for building, are you ready for this? Yes, school buildings, stadiums. Do you think, you can't even say this with a straight face. Natatoriums, that's a fancy way of saying for more pools, and things like that. Performing arts facilities, much as I love the arts, a performing arts facility. And this thing passed 8-0. It was unanimous. And in case you want to know more, first of all, this comes from our friends at the Texan, so you can read it in its entirety. The very significant amount of it is for school buildings, and some of that is for construction, acquisition of other buildings and equipment. Then some of it is for technology equipment. That might be, computers and maybe video screens and whatever. Then improvements and renovations to existing stadiums. Those would be football stadiums. See how well that's going to go over to the American people, and especially the Dallas taxpayers right now. Whether you're living in the state of Texas or you're one of the listeners from another state, just imagine if your local city suggested that we're going to have a bond proposal to renovate some of the stadiums, some of the football stadiums. Then again, I appreciate the arts, but again, some of the performing arts facilities probably could get by for a while with that. And then the other one is, of course, for the natatoriums, which is, of course, basically to improve the pools. And you just, as I said sometimes before, cannot make this stuff up. So one more Texas story, and then we'll move on to some others. And this one comes from our good friend, Colonel Allen West. You know that Colonel Allen West has sat in this chair. He sat across from me sometimes. He has joined with us on a number of occasions. But in addition to being very much involved with us here at Point of View and also the interim head at the Hope Center, he, of course, is the chairman of the Republican Party of Texas. And when they were down in Houston having this meeting, which censured, I would have to say, the governor, he also had a press conference, and I'm looking at this picture of him standing in front of a number of individuals, some with masks, some that not. Maybe some of the others had masks and just took it off when they're standing there. And nevertheless, called for the state attorney general, that'd be Ken Paxton, to seize more than 2 million mail-in ballot applications in Harris County if the clerk, Chris Hollins, refuses to follow election law and these court orders. As we've talked about on this program, also with, again, the state senator, Angela Paxton, who is married to Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, has filed lawsuits preventing the mailing of 2.4 million applications. And as a result, you have the Supreme Court issuing a stay to halt that from taking place. You would think that would be it, and you would be wrong. Because it turns out that the individual that we have just talked about here, who actually is responsible, that Chris Hollins, is part of the Texas Democratic Party. He's the senior member of the state Democratic Party. He's the vice chairman of finance for the Texas Democratic Party. And I think he is convinced that if he wants to get as many Democrat votes as possible, he wants to mail those applications out, even though he has been prevented by doing that by the state board, by the Supreme Court of Texas, and by some other rulings as well. And so Allen West decided he was going to push the issue, and he said, we want Hollins to publicly pledge to follow through with the court orders from the Texas Supreme Court and the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court to immediately halt any plans to release the millions of ballot applications across Harris County. And you'd say, well, that's got to be it, right? No, it's not. Because despite the court rulings, it turns out Hollins has continued to prepare the materials for the mass mailings of these applications. And last week, the Harris County Commissioners approved $1.5 million contract with Runbeck Election Services to print and process mail-in ballots for the county. So even though there's a court order, even though he's been told by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and the Texas Supreme Court not to do that, now you have Allen West, Colonel Allen West, saying, we just can't trust him. And so we need to have the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, to actually go in there and to actually stop the printing at the printing office and to make sure that those are not mailed out. So are some of the most interesting news stories out of the state of Texas. And we'll get back into the national news in just a few minutes, but I just thought you might like to know about that one because, again, might have been covered here on Point of View, but not so much in the mainstream press. We'll be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Spending some time now, if we could, just looking at a very interesting announcement that came from Princeton University. The other day, I used something that Marlon Maddox, the original host of Point of View, used to talk about. He said, I have a file cabinet and go to my file, and this one comes from the Words Have Meaning file. And it turns out that, and I'll just read this from our friends at the Wall Street Journal, the folks at Princeton University are supposed to be smart, you think? But you would have to wonder about the intelligence of inviting federal scrutiny by declaring that their own school is guilty of racism. Amid the struggle session with the progressive faculty and students this month, the president of Princeton University published an open letter promising to combat systemic racism at the school, which I thought was interesting because the editors of the Wall Street Journal said, that's an eye-opener since Princeton has assured students and the federal government that it doesn't discriminate. Has the university been lying? Well, enter the education department. That would be the federal education department, which wants to know. The Assistant Secretary of Education, Robert King, wrote to the president requesting records related to his confession of bias. Mr. King said, among other things, you said racism and the damage it does to people of color persist at Princeton, and racist assumptions remain embedded in the structures of the university itself. You got to love this. I don't know if Betsy DeVos was part of this, but Robert King was really smart on this because you know as well as I do, you can have all sorts of people confessing about systemic racism, saying that maybe we have white privilege, that we don't treat black students fairly on campus and society. And those words essentially are meaningless. Because I say them makes me feel good because now I'm standing up for truth. I'm a justice warrior. I have become woke. But I love the fact that the education department said, if that's what you're saying, then we need to have a full federal investigation of Princeton University because here it is. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 provides that no one on the basis of race should be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And as a matter of fact, if you're not familiar, colleges and universities every single year must certify to the Department of Education that this is true, and if it is not true, they do not receive federal funds. There are some universities that do not certify that, not because they're racist, but they just don't want federal funds. That would be Hillsdale College, that would be Grove City College, and a few others. But everybody else says, oh, no, that's the case. And so I just love this because the president of Princeton, wanting to try to mollify some of the concerns on the part of some of these individuals that are convinced that we have a racist institution here at Princeton University, was willing to then put out an open letter promising to combat systemic racism at the school. And you got to love Robert King, Assistant Secretary of Education, who then writes that he's concerned that Princeton's assurances, which they actually have to file each year with the Department of Education, may have been false. It's many non-discriminatory and equal opportunity claims to students, parents, and consumers in the market for education certificates may have been false, misleading, and actionable substantial misrepresentations in violation of federal law. And I just got to love it because up until now, you can make all sorts of statements about I apologize for systemic racism and I am certainly going to try to do better to root out systemic racism. And in this case, those words do have consequences. And, of course, Andrew McCarthy is an individual we've had on this program before. I love his piece that came out just the other day, Systemic Racism. Make them prove it. And he points out that if you really wanted to begin to argue for systemic racism, and he wasn't at the time just looking at Princeton, but he says the legal elites will insist there's systemic racism. And he said, but no one seems to be able to put their finger on it. A little bit later, he said, this idea of institutional racism is something we hear about, but it should be subjected to rationalism, enlightened rationalism, and very specific evidence that might indeed be the case. So there are a lot of people that are starting to say, okay, you've been using that term. First of all, what do you mean by it? Second of all, what evidence do you have by it? And the Department of Education said, well, if you indeed are arguing that you have engaged in it, then you shouldn't receive federal funds. By the way, this is known as deterrence. You can believe that there are other university professors and presidents and others that are thinking, I might not want to say this out loud because then we might actually affect the gravy train that we receive from the federal government. Which brings me to my commentary today. My Viewpoints commentary is called Racial Disparities, in which, again, I point out that oftentimes anymore, when we see any disparity due to races, the natural inclination is to assume racial prejudice or discrimination. And I give you some very good pieces from Mario Loyola, columnist I'm starting to read more and more and really appreciate, in which he takes us to some things like the New York Police Department, primarily to take on some of the issues we've talked about before with Heather McDonald. And so sometimes the disparities are due to the fact that you're dealing with people that, in the case of the police, are actually engaged in crime. And one of the things he points out, which I quote in the column, is why is there a disproportionate number of individuals who actually are being arrested? And he goes out and says there's a disproportionate number of 911 calls that come from black neighborhoods. So if you wanted fewer cops in black neighborhoods, then maybe you should tell the citizens to stop making 911 calls. Of course, I'm being somewhat facetious, but you can see those calls to the police are trying to help deal with a crime that's taken place. So it steps you back one step further. Now, can we explain all racial disparities? No. And my latest booklet on racism gives you a couple of examples of not necessarily intended discrimination, but, if you will, maybe racial perceptions or misperceptions. One example I've just pulled to here is a study that was done a number of years ago that found that people with black-sounding names had to send out 50% more job applications than people with white-sounding names. And so does that mean that they didn't get the job? Not necessarily, but it does illustrate in that particular study, which was of the National Bureau of Economic Research, that sometimes these names can be perceived. By the way, there was a follow-up study on that. Even after I posted this, I realized I probably should have put the disclaimer in there, because there were some that concluded it wasn't so much necessarily in terms of black-sounding names as it was in terms they were not necessarily making choices as much on race as they were on class. Now, I'm not excusing that. You know, what does the scripture say? You know, if you have a wealthy person comes into your church, you don't give them the position of prominence and you put poor people in the back of the church. Okay, so James addresses that. So even making class distinctions is wrong. But I think there were maybe for some of these individuals saying, you know, and let's take it out of race for just a minute. If I've got somebody whose name is Edward John Smith, that probably he's going to fit in my company a little better than a guy by the name of Bubba Smith. You with me on that? And so the point is, some people, when they look back at this very classic study, which came out a couple of years ago, said some of the decisions may not have been based so much on race as they were based upon class. I'm not excusing that, but I'm simply saying that sometimes when you see racial disparities, it is due to the fact that everybody has some kind of bias. Everybody has certain perceptions about other individuals. And you know as well as I do that if you saw on a resume Edward John Smith III, and you see that he went to very good schools, you go, okay, I'm a little more interested in him, especially if I'm in a white-collar business, and I see somebody else whose name is Bubba or Buford or something like that, probably going to make a decision on the basis of that too. Not fair to Buford or Bubba, but it is, again, just an illustration that sometimes, whether it's race or a variety of other things, sometimes class, sometimes a number of things, we do have these unconscious biases. So I'm not necessarily always arguing against that. But my commentary today, if nothing else, helps us understand that just because we see a significant statistical difference between black and white doesn't always necessarily indicate racial prejudice or discrimination. Watching the Stars lose yesterday reminded me that not a lot of African Americans playing NHL hockey and a whole lot of African Americans playing NBA basketball. We recognize that has nothing to do with discrimination and everything to do with ability and background. So if you want to take that trite example, it's another way of looking at this issue of race and racial disparities. That's my commentary, and if nothing else, we'll see what kind of federal investigation Princeton University is going to have to endure because of an open letter by the president. We'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and of course, we're in the midst of a presidential campaign, so I thought we might address some of those issues in just a minute. There's going to be a lot of fact-checking there, and as a matter of fact, it might just be exhausting every day to talk about all the fact-checking, because let's be honest, we've had a president for 3.5 years that tends to say some things that to be candid, are very inaccurate. And so there is all sorts of fact-checking that has been taking place in his presidency. And, of course, now the fact-checking is taking place as well because you have, of course, individual, Joe Biden, who tends to make things up. We'll get into that in just a minute. But one of the things that I thought might be worth mentioning is the fact that CNN, which has been willing up until now to give the former Vice President Joe Biden a pass, decided to start fact-checking him on a couple of the really outrageous things that he's had to say. It's kind of like, dog bites man, no news. Man bites dog, that's news. And when CNN all of a sudden says, wait a minute, some of the things that Joe Biden's been saying are not accurate, not the least of which the one that was the doozy the other day, that if indeed we didn't have Trump blowing all this, nobody would die of COVID-19. Okay, that was a pretty extreme one, but okay, we'll set that one aside because it was so much hyperbole, I didn't take it seriously. But the two that CNN picked out were kind of interesting because it related to this whole issue of the Supreme Court nominee. And that is, Joe Biden argued that he thought it would be inappropriate for him to release his list of prospective Supreme Court nominees, as Donald Trump did in 2016 and did again this month, and then made the claim that the Trump campaign had not even asked him to release the list until after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. Well, CNN said, no. This is just wrong, CNN says. The Trump campaign and Trump himself have repeatedly said prior to Ginsburg's death that Biden should release a list of prospective Supreme Court nominees. When Trump released his list on November 9th, the Trump campaign statement said in its title, Biden must do the same. The campaign repeated the demand last Thursday, which is, of course, the day before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. So 3 cheers for CNN for finally setting the record straight. Here's another one that should concern you a little bit because one of the arguments that Joe Biden made was this. He said the Senate should wait to confirm the next justice because the former Vice President, Joe Biden, said there's no court session between now and the end of the election. In case you don't know, October 1st is the first day of the Supreme Court. And again, let's give credit to CNN. Biden's claim is simply inaccurate. The court's next session is scheduled to begin, I guess it's actually on October 5th, Monday, October 5th, nearly a month before the election of November 3rd. So 3 cheers for CNN for actually doing some fact-checking on the vice president. And it also brings us back to a very good piece that David Harsanyi points out, and he calls it The Secret Life of Joe Biden. Now, for those of you that ever read the book or the short story, I guess you should say, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, does anybody even know what that is anymore? Okay, I see a couple of expressions that some people at least have heard of that. And, of course, they did do, I think, a rather crummy movie about it. But the point is that they point out that from time to time, Joe Biden over the years has told all sorts of stories. And we won't go back to all the issues of the 1980s, the plagiarism and all that that's well known. But just recently, Joe Biden was telling an audience at Dartmouth about this story, and you've probably heard it repeated before, of this brave Navy captain rappelled down this steep ravine in the mountains of Kunar province in trying to rescue his comrades. And so then he was going to, as the vice president, fly out to pin a medal on him. And he said, sir, I don't want it. Don't pin it on me and all the rest. The only problem is there was really nobody that ever was engaged in any kind of activity like that. The vice president didn't go there himself. So it's kind of a Walter Mitty kind of story. There's another one. He was talking about how he was really very much involved in the civil rights movement. He says, when I was 17, I participated in sit-ins to desegregate restaurants and movie houses and all the rest. They point out that in the real world, Joe Biden was 17 in 1959, and there is no evidence that he ever participated in any sit-ins at any of the local Wilmington, Delaware cinemas or anything else. He also imagined himself, and on more than one occasion has talked about him being involved in some of the greatest civil rights struggles, and yet during the time in which he says that was taking place, he was hanging out, as his now vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris likes to point out, with people that were segregationists. That would be James Eastland, Herman Talmadge, J. William Fulbright, Strom Thurmond. And so you have those stories. And then, of course, one that does go a little further back than some of the more recent ones is his constant story about when he first got into law school, he didn't do very well, but he ended up graduating in the top half of his class. He won the International Moot Court Competition, and he actually, as an outstanding student in political science department, at the end of the year, graduated with 3 degrees from undergraduate school, and as a result of then actually said, I would compare my IQ to yours, Frank, and apparently Frank had challenged him a little bit. But the trouble is that Biden hadn't attended Syracuse Law School on a full academic scholarship. That was one of his other claims. He hadn't finished in the top half of his class. He was 76th out of 85. He hadn't won any award for being the outstanding political science student at the University of Delaware. And he hadn't graduated from the university with 3 degrees, but just a single BA. But other than that, as they like to point out, everything else he said is true. So this is going to be something which, if indeed the fact checkers want to take on, is going to be a big issue, because sometimes because of his ego, Donald Trump says some things that are inaccurate. And sometimes because in some respects he sort of lives in a different world, Joe Biden does so. And one of the things that he starts out by saying in this piece, David Harsanyi says, you might remember Seinfeld, where Jerry is accused of lying. And so his girlfriend at that time was a police officer, wanted him to take a polygraph. And so he was trying to learn from George Costanza how he could beat the polygraph. And he says, well, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it. And I'm thinking that Joe Biden has lived in a world long enough of telling these stories that he doesn't think he's lying. He really believes that that happened. And it's the secret life of Joe Biden. Just before we take a break, though, one more concern that is surfacing, and that is this decision that came out of Michigan now says that absentee ballots do not have to arrive on election night. They don't even have to arrive within a week after the election night. According to a state judge, they can keep counting those ballots 14 days after the election. And given the fact that we had such a close election in Michigan last time in the presidential election, it virtually, I think, almost guarantees, unless there's just an incredible landslide, that this election will go into overtime. Which kind of brings us back to the fact that if we have a Supreme Court with just 8 individuals, you could end up with a 4-4 tie. And we need a 5-4 tie if indeed the Supreme Court has to resolve something that never gets quite resolved, as it did back in the 2000 election. Anyway, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend some time talking with Natasha Crain about talking with your kids about Jesus. Leland Ryken will be with us at 2 o'clock, 40 favorite hymns for the Christian year, which I think you'll enjoy as well. We've really gotten out of the habit of singing hymns in church, and yet some great theology is taught in those hymns, so we'll talk about that with Dr. Leland Ryken, and we look forward to a great opportunity to cover some of these issues. And of course, I'll have a few things to say, obviously, about the Supreme Court nominee and what we are going to be facing over the next couple of weeks. But we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think you guys, y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to, in just a few minutes, talk with our friend Natasha Crain about this new book, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. Next hour, we're going to have Dr. Leland Ryken with us as well, and so there are lots of things that we will cover, but let's, of course, acknowledge that we are going to be in the midst of a lot of conversation over the next couple of weeks about who will actually be nominated by Donald Trump later this week, and then who might indeed be confirmed to the Supreme Court. The odds-on favorite, probably Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who is an individual that serves right now in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, has been involved in about 100 different opinions, so we do have some kind of legal record for her. Individual that came from the Notre Dame School of Law, and so we'll get into some of that. But even if we do not cover all of that today, I wanted to highlight a couple of resources that we have put on the website. First one by Kelly Shackelford, who was with us on Friday. As soon as that decision came down to actually nominate an individual after we all heard of the untimely death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Kelly Shackelford wrote a piece, and it's our first article here. America can't afford to wait for a new Supreme Court justice. It is an opinion that appeared in Newsweek, and so we have that available on our website, and I would encourage you to read that. And Kelly, of course, is usually with us on Friday. He won't be with us this Friday, but we'll certainly be able to get into some of the arguments that he makes there. And at the same time, we've also had individuals suggest that if indeed Republicans move ahead with the attempt to confirm this individual, whoever that might be put forward by the president, Donald Trump, that then this would lead to the attempt by the Democrats to pack the court. The second article we've posted here today by Charles Cook, Court Packing is a Silly Idea and the Senate Knows It, and points out the fact that Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, has said he was against the idea of court packing. Even if he were to change his mind, who would vote for it? Joe Manchin, who voted to confirm Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh? What about some of the others that oftentimes tend to be a little more of the swing votes in the Democratic Senate? John Tester, Kirsten Sinema. As a matter of fact, you would, if you even assume that you'd have a Democratic Senate majority, have had newly elected individuals from Arizona, Iowa, North Carolina. And the question being asked by Charlie Cook is, are these swing staters really going to line up behind this nuclear option during the first year of their new jobs? And so it helps answer some questions that are sort of lingering out there as well. But just before we get to Natasha Crain, I also want to say thank you. Since yesterday was the Millennial Roundtable, and again, I want to thank Chelsea Ullman for being a part of the Roundtable. This is the first time I've had a chance to speak to you after we did our Truth Team Week last week, which was outstanding. We had assumed that maybe, even given the economic downturn, the lockdown, the pandemic, and all the rest, that if we could just even reach maybe the average response, we would be thrilled, and we exceeded that dramatically. And since many of you were maybe listening on Friday, when in the last half hour we had an individual on the program that suggests that if you could finish off the last $25,000, I would give you a gift of $50,000. That seemed like an incredible hill to climb, and yet by the end of that evening, we were able to do so. And so the bottom line is that it was a very successful Truth Team Week, which is what we do twice a year, just to come to you and thank you for your interest in this ministry and challenge you to give your support. And so we want to say thank you for all of you that have made this possible. This was an incredible, far beyond even our expectations, a week, and this has been the first opportunity I've had to say thank you for that. If you always want to know, did we make our goal? Yes, we made the goal and exceeded it, and that's due to your generosity. So thank you so very much. Let's, if we can, now go to a wonderful presentation I know you're going to enjoy. Natasha Crain is a national speaker, author, and blogger. We, in the past, have mentioned her books and sometimes interviewed her on those, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, Talking with Your Kids About God, and this one, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. She has an MBA from UCLA, a certificate in Christian apologetics from Biola University. And Natasha, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk with you again.
One of the things that we have done here, and I won't spend a lot of time on it other than to mention that you are such a good blogger. A number of months ago, you had one, 5 Ways Christians Are Getting Swept into a Secular Worldview in This Cultural Moment. And when you posted that, I quoted from you, even though you weren't on the program with us. And then the most recent one I've posted up here, How to Explain to Your Kids Why Social Justice Warriors Hate Christians So Much. And I do appreciate the fact that in addition to doing all of the great work that you do in the area of apologetics, you also are addressing many of these really important social issues from a Christian point of view, and people can find those on your blog, can't they?
Yeah, and thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's kind of funny because a lot of people were starting to say, wow, this is great to hear about these other topics. It's not directly related to parenting, but they really appreciate it because a lot of parents are getting confused on these issues. So that's really how I started writing about this ever since the death of George Floyd, was just to kind of get parents to think more about these bigger picture questions, because certainly their kids are going to be thinking about them too, especially as they get into the middle and teen years.
Well, and again, people that might say, I've heard the phrase critical race theory, but don't know really what it is, or I see some of these issues and some of these protests, and I know a little bit about Black Lives Matter, but I don't really know what they stand for. So in some respects, you're taking that same keen apologetic mind that you have and applying it to some of the social issues. So I wanted people to know those exist as well. They can find the one that we posted, How to Explain to Your Kids Why Social Justice Warriors Hate Christians So Much. That's the kind of question you might be getting. And even more so, the concern that you mentioned back in, I guess it was June, ways in which Christians are getting kind of swept into a secular worldview in terms of that cultural moment. So you can scan down and find some of those as well. This particular book really helps us understand how to really answer these questions that our kids might have. In the past, we've talked about how to talk to your kids about God. Now we're going to talk about how to talk to people and young people in particular, and your kids, about Jesus. A wonderful foreword by Lee Strobel, and 30 different chapters broken into the identity of Jesus, then the teachings of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and the difference Jesus makes. And one of the things I so appreciate is each chapter finishes, there is a section of key points. Then there's a conversation guide, which includes open the conversation, advance the conversation, and apply the conversation. So it is just a great resource. And from time to time, we do get individuals saying, do you have something so I can teach some of this to our kids? And I remember decades ago, sometimes we'd mention, Lael Arrington's book, World Proofing Your Kids. But now, due to you, Natasha, and J. Warner Wallace, and so many other individuals, they're just great books to put in the hands of so many parents. And this one has just come out, and it's published by Baker Books. So let's take a break. We're going to come back and talk about how to talk to your kids about Jesus. And I think even while we talk about how to educate our kids, I think we'll learn some things as well as parents. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program recently, one of my guests mentioned that it is nearly always assumed that any racial disparities are due to racism. When there is a significant difference between black and white citizens, certainly racial prejudice or discrimination should be considered, but it shouldn't always be the assumed conclusion. Mario Loyola believes that we can find other explanations. For example, according to reports from the New York Police Department, black men are arrested and prosecuted in about 60 to 70% of every category of violent crime, though they are just over 10% of the city's population. He then points out that there is a major disparity, and that is due to the disproportionate number of 911 calls from black neighborhoods. Now, I suppose you could argue that if you want fewer cops in black neighborhoods, then the citizens should make fewer 911 calls. Those calls to police are for help dealing with crimes that are occurring in that neighborhood. Another disparity can be found in the prisons. More than 5% of black males are in prison at any given time. This is 5 times the incarceration rate of whites. Yet again, if we look at New York City, we discover that criminal suspects in the city are disproportionately black, since most of the victims of crime in the city are black. These two examples aren't meant to say that all racial disparities can be explained away. My point is to briefly illustrate why we shouldn't immediately assume that any significant difference in statistics between races is due to racial prejudice or some form of discrimination. If we are to truly address issues of race in society and remedy true discrimination, we would be better served not to jump to such conclusions. Sometimes there are other reasonable explanations for such disparities. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, we've talked about the book Talking with Your Kids About God, this one Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, and the book has been out for a couple of months. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but as always, some of you say, well, I don't have a nearby local bookstore, or they don't carry all the books, so we've made it possible for you to get this in paperback or Kindle. I also noticed one of the links that we had, I think it was to Amazon, actually listed all 3 of the books by Natasha so that you could get each one of them together, keeping your kids on God's side, talking with your kids about God and talking with your kids about Jesus. So might recommend that as well. But Natasha, let's, if we can, talk about the identity of Jesus. And one of the things I appreciated about you is because of your background and because early on you were reading a book by John Dominic Crossan about Jesus and are aware of the New Atheist, the Jesus Seminar, and all of the rest. You really help identify some of the kinds of questions that will surface from your kids that maybe they don't even know who some of those authors are, but they are on Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat, or they're having conversations, texting back and forth, in which they wonder whether Jesus even existed, whether he's just a myth, whether he really claimed to be God, whether he performed miracles. And that's the first section of your book, because you're trying to answer the questions that young people are asking that you found when you were growing up, nobody was there to answer.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of times parents kind of skip over this whole identity question because we go straight to the idea of, well, let's talk to our kids about what Jesus taught. and let's make sure that they're living their lives in line with Jesus' teachings. But we forget to ask that question first of, how do we know that Jesus was who he said he was? Because if we can't be confident about that in his identity, that Jesus was God himself, then it doesn't follow that we need to pay any attention to his teachings. And so they're only as important as they have the authority from Jesus as God. And so that's why it's so important that parents kind of start here. And it might not be a comfortable conversation, because a lot of parents say, well, I don't really know how to go about explaining that. I know that Jesus existed as a person in history and that kind of thing. But it's where we have to start today, because this is so often the challenge. People are fine saying, yeah, Jesus taught about loving people and we should love people. But it's when you get into the identity questions that kids face so many questions today. And so that's where we have to start. And that's why the book starts off with that section.
Well, again, you have all sorts of individuals, as you well know, since you, of course, have studied apologetics, that challenge the authority of the Bible, challenge the historical accuracy of Jesus, challenge whether or not he performed any miracles. Sometimes, of course, even challenge whether Jesus claimed to be God. And so as much as we tend, as you said, to want to skip over this is a very important part. And talk about how to use the conversation guide, because some, as you said, parents might say, do I really need to go through this? I mean, what you could do is read a section a night, or you could pull out a couple of conversation starters or something like that and see where your kids are. And just the fact that you were willing to put yourself out there saying, look, I don't know as much about this as Natasha does, but I can read the book, and I can certainly talk about the fact that I was looking at the number of people that have endorsed your book, and I think I counted at least 9 or 10 of those individuals have been on this program with us, who are some of the best of the best. You can then help our kids know that just because they saw it on Facebook, just because somebody said it in a class, even because one of their high school teachers or junior high school teachers said it, doesn't make it true. And it really begins a conversation that will then cause them to have a deeper faith in Jesus Christ.
That's right, absolutely. And I think that because a lot of parents are intimidated to have these kinds of conversations, they're not things that are often talked about in church in a lot of cases, the conversation guides kind of give parents the confidence that they can do this. And so they just start from very easy questions and step into the material a little bit more at a time. So if you have a very young child, maybe your kid's only 5 or 6 years old right now, some parents say, well, can I even start at that age? And you absolutely can, because the first question in the conversation guide is just kind of an opener to get the conversation going and get your kids to think about the topic. And maybe that's all you talk about at that age is the answer to that first question. But then as they get older, you can continue to go deeper into the more advanced questions. And some parents just read the chapter with their kids if they feel more comfortable about doing it that way. But either way, it's there so you can facilitate the conversation with them. And even if your kid hasn't thought of the question already, it's important to put the question in front of them, because they will encounter it at some point. And it's better to be the one who brings it to them, so you have the opportunity to have that conversation rather than someone else.
You know, I was just thinking that sometimes when we talk about when do you start talking about sex education with your kids, as young as possible, because then you are the authority. They will come to you with questions, and you can't start anything talking about that subject too early. And I'd say the same thing about this area of the identity of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus as well, because in some respects, they're going to confront these questions very early. And the assumption is, well, we need to prepare our high school seniors for what they're going to encounter in college. But we've had interviews, for example, already gone, and Britt Beeman and some of those, and Ken Ham and others that say, really, in some respects, there are young people in the junior high or middle school years that have already given up on Christianity. So start early and take this material and use it effectively. 30 different chapters, and we have 5 parts. So let's move on to the second one, which people might feel more comfortable with, the teachings of Jesus, until they get to chapter 7. Did Jesus teach that he's the only way to God? That's one of those ones which is sometimes very difficult for young people to address. And again, it's important to begin to address that early on, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is a claim that kids will hear all the time in our culture because it seems very intolerant and very exclusive to say, well, there's only one way to God, and that's through Jesus. And so, and people can make it seem like it makes sense to say, well, we can get there lots of different ways. There are lots of different people in the world with different beliefs. And if kids haven't been trained to think more critically about this and to actually dig into what that claim is, then they're going to be misled by what sounds good rather than what's actually true. And it's not enough to just kind of quote from the Bible one verse and tell our kids, yeah, well, Jesus said he is the way, the truth, and the light, and no one comes to the Father except through me. That's great, and we should point to that, but we need to go a little bit deeper than that and help them understand the reasoning behind it. And I've used an example with my kids in terms of a map. If you have lots of different ways to get somewhere, not every way is going to get you there. And so some of these little examples I use in the book just to help kids to think about this more clearly.
Very good. Again, you have whole sections here on everything from religion, hell, and whatever. But let me take one more while we're in this idea of teaching. What did Jesus teach about judging others? And I have said before, Natasha, that it used to be the most quoted verse, especially in the youth groups of John 3:16. I think the most quoted verse now is Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. And so everybody says, well, we can't judge. And I say, well, read a little further and you'll see that you have really wrenched that verse out of context. And it gets back again to this idea that Christians are perceived as being intolerant, and we really need to help equip our young people today to address that issue of making wise decisions and having discernment and making sound judgment, don't we?
That's right. Yes, it's really important because we hear this all the time that we're not supposed to judge, and people kind of laser cut that one verse, Matthew 7:1, out of the Bible, but they haven't read on to see that that's really just a precursor to a whole text about not judging hypocritically. And that's what we need our kids to understand, is that we are absolutely called to discernment. As Christians, we have to have solid discernment, knowing what's right and wrong. We're not called to condemn another. That alone belongs to God, that final decision on someone's life. And those two different meanings come up at different points in the Bible, and our kids need to understand the difference. But we're absolutely called to discernment when done with the right motivation, the right heart. And that's a whole different thing than saying, oh, well, we should never judge because Jesus said not to judge at all.
And again, we are coming to a break here, and we'll come back and get into some other issues, but the key points help you begin to explain that to your young child or grandchild. Then you have a conversation about some of the surveys that are done, and then encourage them to read that in context, and all of a sudden begin to understand really what Jesus was talking about, and then how to even begin to apply the conversation. So when we come back from the break, we want to get into a couple of other areas. One of those is the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. Very important, and sometimes things that we sort of skip over again because we assume, well, they've heard it in church, so we don't really need to go into it. But the significance of that is key. And then finally, the difference Jesus makes. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I need to get a copy of the book, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. The bottom line is it's about 300 pages, paperback. And if you do find it there, great. But we also have a link to Natasha Crain's website, and you can find those blog posts that we've mentioned just a minute ago. Of course, the book has been out for some time, and I would encourage you to get this one along with the previous book, Talking with Your Kids About God, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. The two really come together in a very significant way, and when we come back, we'll pick up a few more of the issues that are addressed in the book. It's published by Baker. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it, so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. We'll continue our conversation about talking with your kids about Jesus right after this.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Natasha Crain with us as we continue talking about her book, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have, forward by Lee Strobel. But also, for just a minute, Natasha might talk about your website, ChristianMomThoughts.com. Of course, people don't have to remember all that. Simply go to pointofview.net. We have a link there. Of course, we have posted one of your blog posts, but I would recommend so many others. Of course, we talked about the one about 5 ways Christians are getting swept into a secular worldview. And if I could also commend you on the response that you had after that came out, Christian naivete is harming the church's engagement today's culture, how to build a more discerning, less naive, and better culturally engaged church. Every one of these by you are just must read. So it is just thrilling that we could have you on the program today. And I would encourage people not only to get a copy of the book, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, but to make sure that they read your blog post on a regular basis.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much.
Let's, if we can, get into this section in your book on the death of Jesus. And again, I guess I'm just full of compliments today. I'm so grateful that you put that in there, because you know as well as I do, there is just a real tendency to kind of run it all together. Death, burial, resurrection. You know, we so want to get to the resurrection that we don't talk about the death of Jesus. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps our children understand the seriousness of sin. It helps them understand things like the animal sacrifices. It really helps them understand that some of the most important kind of prophetic utterances and even predictions Jesus makes about his death and his resurrection are there. So a whole section on death would have been probably left out of a lot of books, but you included it. So talk about that, because I think even though it's shorter than some of the others, I think it was very key, and I'm glad you put it in there in the first place.
Yeah, I think you're right that this gets skipped over an awful lot, especially by parents, because it feels a little bit uncomfortable to explain, well, why do we need this whole blood sacrifice thing? And of course, skeptics make a big deal about this, right? You know, I quote someone in here, a pastor who has a book called Obsessed with Blood, the Crazy Things That Christians Believe. And it talks about Christians are obsessed with blood. And it does sound kind of foreign to us in our modern world, if we're honest about it. Why do we have to have blood sacrifice? And especially in a culture where people no longer really believe that stuff is sinful in some kind of objective sense, we really have to be prepared as parents to explain to our kids why there's a good reason to believe that sin is a real thing and why it is so bad. And ultimately, and interestingly, that goes back to a question of whether or not God exists. You know, if there's good reason to believe that God exists and he has given us a moral law, then we start getting into, okay, well, what happens if someone breaks that moral law? And that's how we start getting into this conversation about sin and the nature of that. So sometimes we have to take even a few steps back from the death of Jesus to understand the whole context of what we're talking about and why it would even matter, because so many people today just throw the whole concept out and say, well, you know, there's no such thing as sin because there's no such thing as God. So many of these subjects actually tie together. And you mentioned earlier my other book, Talking to Kids About God, that goes into all of that evidence for the existence of God, which leads into this one.
Certainly does. And again, when we sometimes use big words like the atonement, you know, you have a section here, what did Jesus' death accomplish? And a very long list of things that are part of that. Jesus' death atoned for our sins. It removed us from the curse of the law, reconciled us to God. It demonstrated God's love. It defeated the power of Satan. It gave us eternal life. Sometimes, like I said, we don't spend as much time on that, and yet if we can do so, especially when children are at a young age, then they understand, oh, maybe I should read the Old Testament. I thought I only had to read the parts that were in red letters because that's all that really matters. And so that was just, I thought it was very good that you added that. But I thought we'd move on to the one that everybody would expect, and that is the resurrection. And again, I love that you quoted at one point from Richard Dawkins. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be teaching at a Bible Institute, and usually by the end of the week, I have to say, I apologize that I've felt like many times you think I've been using Richard Dawkins as a whipping boy, but he always got these great comments that illustrate the point. And one of those was he was asked, one of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, what happened to the body of Jesus? Well, probably what happened to all of us. It decomposes, and the accounts of the resurrection and ascension are about as well documented as Jack and the Beanstalk. Well, Richard Dawkins, we disagree for a variety of different reasons, but if nothing else, that's why you have a section on the resurrection, because that itself is so important that when it came time for the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians to really set forth the case for the truthfulness of the gospel, he takes us immediately to the resurrection of Jesus.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important things I want parents to take away from this entire section is why the resurrection is so important. Paul gives us a truth test for all of Christianity in that verse, that if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is in vain. And so it's so important to understand. Sometimes it seems like this huge question, how do we know Christianity is true? Well, Paul brings us right back to the resurrection, that is the truth test for Christianity. So we should have some very good reasons for believing that something very extraordinary actually happened. And so we can go through all of this evidence, and I have 6 chapters there that talk about the evidence for the resurrection from a historical perspective. But the other thing that's so important for parents to understand and to communicate to their kids is that no matter how much historical evidence you give some people, they're not going to consider it at all because they have already assumed, they have ruled out the possibility that God exists in the first place. So if you're going from that presupposition that God doesn't exist, of course you're going to say miracles are not possible. There is no resurrection. I'm tossing aside all of this evidence that you're providing me in these chapters. And that's a starting point for discussion with our kids to say, look, if someone doesn't believe God exists at all, none of this stuff's going to matter. But if we look at the evidence for God's existence and we say, yes, there is good reason to believe that God indeed exists, therefore miracles are possible, then we can look at the historical evidence and say, what's the evidence that a miracle actually happened? And ultimately, that's what these chapters are helping parents explain to their kids.
Let's talk about that for just a minute, because sometimes you run into individuals. I would have to say that was probably true more in my parents' generation, the old, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. If people already reject this idea, then all this work that you have been doing in the area of apologetics, trying to set forth evidence for your faith, is meaningless. But the bottom line is I think we have throughout history, lots of individuals who set out to try to disprove the resurrection of Jesus, including one of the individuals who wrote a foreword to your book, as well as Josh McDowell. And, you go down this long, long list of individuals that set forth to disprove it. And trying to disprove it, they became believers. So there is a sense in which, yes, people can oftentimes reject evidence out of hand, but it does cause some of them to begin to reconsider that, or to maybe feel like it's sort of a rock in their shoe that they need to take advantage of, or that there is a challenge that they need to rise up against. And so in some respects, there's always been a little bit of hesitancy to say, even if I give this non-Christian friend all the evidence for the resurrection, all the evidence for the gospel, they'll still reject it. Yes, they will, but at least it provides a context, I believe, for which the Holy Spirit can oftentimes work in their lives.
Sure, yes, that is absolutely true. I think that when you look at the historical facts that surround the resurrection event and you try to explain those and you say, okay, well, here are the basic facts that we have. What's the best explanation given what we see historically? Then when you start to look at all the possible explanations and you see how they fail to explain these things in terms of the scope or in terms of the depth, then you start to say, okay, well, what is the best explanation? And if you haven't ruled out the supernatural explanation of a resurrection, then you start to see that makes all of these historical facts actually come together in a beautiful way.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll answer the so what question, because we've talked about the identity of Jesus, 6 chapters there, really helping you make the case there to yourself or to your children or grandchildren. Then part 2, the teachings of Jesus, in which we have 6 more chapters that talk about the teachings of Jesus in terms of loving others and judging others. Then, of course, what we have been talking about now, the death of Jesus, which again, a number of chapters there that address that. And then, of course, what we've just been talking about, the resurrection of Jesus, 6 more chapters. But we still have a little bit more to go. The difference Jesus makes. What is a Christian? How is a person's view of the Bible different as a Christian? How is a person's view of God different as a Christian? What does it mean to be saved? What does it mean to trust in Jesus? And why do Christians want to share their faith with others? So again, we'll get into some of the application elements of this book, which again is about 300 pages, published by Baker Books, and and it's probably available in your local bookstore. But if you have any difficulty finding it, of course, we have a link to Natasha's website. We have, of course, information about it so that you get it in both paperback and Kindle. And I would highly recommend that you get the previous book, Talking with Your Kids About God, as we talk about talking with your kids about Jesus. So let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about the difference Jesus makes and how we would apply some of the things we've been learning today here on Point of View to some of those very significant chapters. And all that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have Natasha Crain with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Talking with Your Kids About Jesus and a section on the difference Jesus makes. Gotta love a writer that can use everything from Legos to Canucks to illustrate basic biblical theology, so that's kind of fun. But you have a chapter here on what is a Christian, and you said, well, for most people that might seem like, oh, that's probably one of the easiest chapters until you begin to understand that there are all sorts of people that claim to be Christians that are not, and young people oftentimes will fall into this idea that, well, he's a good guy, he's probably a Christian, or I know they've gone to church once or twice, so they're probably Christians. And so in some respects, that chapter is very helpful for your young people, isn't it?
It is so important. I can't overestimate the importance of this question. And like you said, it seems like it's a very obvious question in the book. Out of all these other more obscure questions, what is a Christian seems so basic. But even if you look at the research today on religious trends in America, you'll see that about 70% of people will label themselves as a Christian in one way or another. But other research, when they go and look at, okay, but what do people actually believe? And they ask them some basic questions about what they believe about the nature of God, the nature of the Bible, who Jesus is. And depending on the research study that you look at, that number is somewhere between 4 and about 25% who actually have what researchers call a biblical worldview, consistent with what we associate with historic Christianity. So there's this giant gap between those who call themselves a Christian and what people actually believe. And that's, in this chapter, what I was really concerned with is helping parents understand there's a big gap there. We don't want our kids to fall into the gap of thinking that a Christian can basically mean whatever you want it to mean. There were some very specific meanings to that word in the early church, and that's based on the historic Christian faith, not all the changes that you see today to the gospel itself. And so kids need to understand that just because you hear the word Christian or a book is written by a quote-unquote Christian author, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be consistent with the Bible.
I might just mention that a couple of the other chapters deal with how is a person's view of the Bible different as a Christian or their view of God different. But I thought we might get to what does it mean to trust in Jesus? Because, Natasha, one of the things that I see is people oftentimes say you need to trust in Jesus. And I have sometimes just start a conversation saying, what do you mean by trust? And all of a sudden they start looking at their shoes because they really have heard the phrase. They really have not thought about what that really means. Talk about that if you might.
Yeah, I have seen, actually, this is a bit of a soapbox issue for me because I've seen this whole concept really throw people off of their faith. I received a lot of emails from ex-Christians over the years, and a lot of times it's come down to being told as a kid, somebody in their family was very sick, for example. Maybe it was a parent, and another Christian told them, look, they're going to be fine. Just trust in Jesus. And the trust that's implied there is trust in a specific outcome. And when that doesn't happen, it seems like it's a promise that God broke in some way. The person ultimately decides either, one, God just doesn't exist, or if he does exist, two, then he's not the good God that I thought he was. And you see a lot of resentment that comes up for a lot of people when they walk away from their faith over these issues of trust. So it's so important that we choose our words carefully, that we don't just throw it out, well, I'm going to trust in Jesus, but that we're actually trusting in Jesus for the things that the Bible promises. That is consistent with a biblical faith. So we want to trust in who Jesus is, his character, even if we don't have an outcome to prayer, for example, that we're hoping for, that we trust that he is a good God and he's a just God, he's a holy God, all of those characteristics of him, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get the outcome that we hope for. So we want to make sure we're trusting in a way that the Bible tells us we should trust. Otherwise, our expectations don't line up with reality, and we are very disappointed for reasons that we shouldn't be.
Very good. Last chapter, why do Christians want to share their faith with others? I think that's helpful because, first of all, some young people don't understand the Great Commission. I know that one of the surveys we've done at Pro Ministries is we ask, how often do you share your faith? And we personally see a very small number, sometimes in the single digits of percentages. And then we ask them what they share their faith. Well, it means, well, I go to the Bible, I read the Bible sometimes, or go to church. Not exactly the gospel. So first of all, young people don't always understand the Great Commission. But the second part of it is they run into individuals saying, why are you forcing your religion down on me? And so in some respects, you try to answer that question both from the person sharing their faith, talking about the gospel, and from people who may be resisting that and equipping them for what they might encounter when they go out and share their faith.
Right. It's very concerning, actually, when you look at the studies like you're talking about, where you see that 96% of millennials agree that part of their faith means being a witness about Jesus, but almost half also agree that it's wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in the hope that they'll one day share the same faith. So that's a remarkable difference if you think about it, because people say, yes, it's important to be a witness, whatever that means to them, maybe just living a life with quote unquote good values. But it's a whole other thing if you say that you're doing it with the hope that someone will actually come to know Jesus and turn away from some other belief system. And that goes back to just people really having an aversion to feeling that there's an objective truth today, and to realizing that this isn't something offensive. If you're claiming that there's an objective truth that people should come to know, it shouldn't be something you see as wrong to share your faith, because this is in fact what Jesus called us to go forth and make disciples. So we really have a lot of work to do as parents and churches and youth group leaders to help kids understand that, yes, other people might think that it's intolerant in some way, but this really has nothing to do with tolerance. We're just making a claim that there is something that's objectively true and that it's important for people to hear, even if they don't feel that there is an objective truth.
Just before I let you go, let's talk about the fact that we have ChristianMomThoughts.com. We also have a link to your Twitter post and your Facebook page, and they can find so many great articles and blogs. But I know, Natasha, that some people might say, we would sure love to have her come to our church and come and speak. And as we come out of these lockdowns, there may be some great opportunities to do so. So you have information about all of your books. You have your blog. You have some of the speaking opportunities, some of the resources, and a way in which people can contact you if they'd like to book you for an event. So talk about how people can connect up with you and what they find on your website.
Sure. Yeah. You can also go to NatashaCrain.com, just my name, if it's easier for people to remember that. And there's a tab on there for speaking, and there's a little form to fill out if that's something that people are interested in. You can find my blog there, like you said, information about my books. And also I have a resources tab where you can find my book recommendations. I think there have more than 50 books on there for helping parents kind of sort through all of this stuff and go through all of these books that are out there. And I say, okay, if you want to learn about the evidence for God's existence, for example, here are my 5 book recommendations on that. So you basically find these reading plans that I created from all the books that I've read over the years as I went from just being a parent who was looking to equip myself to then helping to equip others.
Well, my recommendations are you get the talking with your kids about God and talking with your kids about Jesus, and put those on your shelf and make the point of not only putting them on your shelf, but pulling them out, reading through those, applying the conversation, and preparing your kids for the world that they were going to go in. So, Natasha, appreciate the work that you've been doing all these years in that regard, and sure appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking with you.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, Dr. Leland Ryken will be with us. We'll have a few comments, certainly, again, about some of the things happening in our world around us, but also wanted you to maybe have a chance to hear about his very insightful book about hymns. Now, I'm not going to get into the worship wars. You can decide what you want to do in terms of how you worship. But many of these classic hymns taught great theology, and we seem to be missing some of that. And so I thought one of the most gifted individuals I know talking about biblical topics and literary topics and all of the rest, emeritus professor of English at Wheaton College, put together this book on 40 favorite hymns for the Christian year, a closer look at the spiritual and poetic meaning. And there's a lot of depth there and a lot of great Christian theology that needs to be expressed. And so I thought you might enjoy that conversation, because we're going to be into it this week with all the things happening in our society. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about hymns. We have not done that very often, although you may be aware of the fact that at Christmas time, I almost always have done a week of commentaries, sometimes 2 weeks of commentaries on the theology of Christmas hymns. So that's something I thought would be appropriate at that time of year. But there are other hymns that certainly are well relevant and worthy of our consideration. So we'll talk about that in just a minute with Dr. Leland Ryken, who's the Emeritus Professor of English at Wheaton College. But let me just mention real quickly that there are a couple of things that we've posted. We recognize this is going to be, in the next couple of weeks, a focus on the Supreme Court nominee, and we have a pretty good idea who that is, but we'll wait till the president announces that, and then we'll see what happens at that point. Of two articles that we've posted on the website, one by Kelly Shackelford, who's with us most Fridays. He will not be with us this Friday, but was with us last Friday, who is the president and CEO and chief counsel with the First Liberty Institute. This one appeared in Newsweek. America can't afford to wait for a new Supreme Court justice. So that article is available to you. It, if you print it out, takes about 5 pages, really makes some really good points, and we'll probably get into that later in the week. Also have another one by Charlie Cook. Charles Cook, court packing is a silly idea, and the Senate knows it. That's kind of been the challenge or the threat coming from some of the Democrats. So those are two articles we've posted for you today to find, and you can certainly read them, maybe post them on your Facebook page or Twitter feed or something of that nature and benefit from that. As a program note, let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have everybody from Marjorie Dannenfelser to Greg Laurie on the program. Really looking forward to those, as well as a number of other interviews we're going to be doing. Dennis Prager will be with us on Thursday, and of course we'll have our weekend edition. So lots of things to look forward to as we get into the rest of the week. Dr. Leland Ryken has been in the past the professor of English at Wheaton College, contributed all sorts of works in the area of classical literature from a Christian perspective, and probably very well known for writing The Christian Imagination. Also, he was the literary stylist for the ESV, English Standard Version of the Bible, published by Crossway, and you can find out a lot of great information about him on the website, which we have posted for you to read as well. And this new book that has come out, 40 Favorite Hymns for the Christian Year. So we won't just be talking about the Christmas hymns, although you've heard me speak on those issues before. And I just really believe that it would be very helpful to you to understand that. Some great endorsements from people like Keith Getty and James Ward and others, and I think you will really appreciate the conversation. And as we open up the phones, maybe you have a favorite hymn or maybe some thoughts about that. And I recognize we're not necessarily going to get into the worship wars, but I think we've lost a great deal. That's about the only statement I'll make when we no longer sing the hymns, because some of the great theology is actually encapsulated in those hymns. So Dr. Leland Ryken, always an opportunity to learn more about English, and in this case, about hymns from you. So thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Very glad to be here.
How, in a sense, should we think about these hymns? Because you've heard me already state that I think we can learn a great deal about hymns. And for individuals maybe in other centuries, maybe weren't as theologically literate, they still learned a great deal about the character of God, about their salvation and other things by singing those hymns, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Now, my slant on it is the great hymns as devotional poems, And that fits in very well with your emphasis on learning to focus on the content of the hymns. Yes, they are a great source of truth and edification, but my literary angle is they are also texts of beauty.
And I would think in some respects you could look at them like you would a poem or something similar and do some analysis. I thought, if I were to do this book, there'd be a lot of hymns from Isaac Watts, and I think I counted about half a dozen, so you agree with me. So let's get into a couple of those. One of those, "O God, our help in ages past." That is the section on the new year. And as much as we love to sing some of these favorite hymns during Christmas time, these hymns also can be used as we begin the new year. But when we talk about Isaac Watts, we're talking about the father of English hymnology. Hymnody, I guess, is the actual word. And yet this one is really based on Psalm 90, isn't it?
It is. Now, I want to say, however, that it would be incorrect to call that poem a paraphrase. Yes, it is indebted to motifs from Psalm 90, and certainly the opening recalls that. It covers more territory than the psalm does. So I have learned to look really closely at the text because they tell us the truth. And yes, psalm paraphrases are a great tradition, but for example, Martin Luther's hymn, Reformation hymn, it is based on Psalm 46.
Sure.
But it's not a paraphrase, so we have to look carefully.
Yes. Well, again, Mighty Fortress is our God. Might get to that in just a minute, but it does seem to me that in some respects, when we hear that first part, "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come," there's a sense in which we expect it to be Psalm 90, but in a sense, it's not, as you said, it's not a paraphrase. It's really an attempt to take some of that theme, or really, if you will, maybe a literary launching point into some other topics that are related to that particular issue. And so often when we sing these hymns, Dr. Ryken, they really bring it from our head to our heart. One of the most significant challenges is that 18 inches from our head to our heart, and it really becomes part of our theology in some respects when we sing it, because it becomes even more so than just reading it, because we're singing it back to the Lord. And in some respects, that's the power of some of these hymns, isn't it?
Yes. Now, I want to hold out, though, for the importance of a words-only text, because it enables us to read slowly, to focus on the words. One of the things I learned in this enterprise of seeing the hymns as devotional poems is the degree to which the great hymn writers compose by stanzas. But I'll speak personally, that gets lost when I am singing the hymns and rushed along. And furthermore, when we see the hymns printed as poems, we not only focus on the words, we see the progression from one stanza to the next. And that just is a whole new experience of a hymn.
Well, if we can, we'll take a break. When we come back, the first section is on the new year, but I thought since we talked about Isaac Watts, let's go to, when we come back from the break, Good Friday, "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross," because as you took us through there, you began to take us through each stanza of the poem, really contributes, as you said, to the speaker's meditation. So we'll talk about that one because, if nothing else, probably a much more familiar hymn. And I'll be honest, even though I'm one of those old guys around the table too, there were a couple of hymns that I've never heard, so it was very helpful to have you pull together some that aren't as familiar, and to really begin to understand how to not only sing them, but to read them and to meditate on them. So that's exactly what we're going to do, and it's all part of this book. It came out last month. It's entitled 40 Favorite Hymns for the Christian Year, a closer look at their spiritual and poetic meaning. So we'll talk about what that means right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program recently, one of my guests mentioned that it is nearly always assumed that any racial disparities are due to racism. When there is a significant difference between black and white citizens, certainly racial prejudice or discrimination should be considered, but it shouldn't always be the assumed conclusion. Mario Loyola believes that we can find other explanations. For example, according to reports from the New York Police Department, black men are arrested and prosecuted in about 60 to 70% of every category of violent crime, though they are just over 10% of the city's population. He then points out that there is a major disparity, and that is due to the disproportionate number of 911 calls from black neighborhoods. Now, I suppose you could argue that if you want fewer cops in black neighborhoods, then the citizens should make fewer 911 calls. Those calls to police are for help dealing with crimes that are occurring in that neighborhood. Another disparity can be found in the prisons. More than 5% of black males are in prison at any given time. This is 5 times the incarceration rate of whites. Yet again, if we look at New York City, we discover that criminal suspects in the city are disproportionately black, since most of the victims of crime in the city are black. These two examples aren't meant to say that all racial disparities can be explained away. My point is to briefly illustrate why we shouldn't immediately assume that any significant difference in statistics between races is due to racial prejudice or some form of discrimination. If we are to truly address issues of race in society and remedy true discrimination, we would be better served not to jump to such conclusions. Sometimes there are other reasonable explanations for such disparities. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Leland Ryken with us as we talk about 40 favorite hymns, sections on the New Year, Good Friday, which we'll focus on now, Easter, Reformation Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. And Dr. Ryken, let's, if we can, go to Isaac Watts, a more familiar hymn for most of our listeners, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And a good example of that is what you were talking about in terms of the fact that we may sing it, but as we go through your chapter here, you begin to break it down stanza by stanza, and each one of those stanzas, again, takes us through some aspect of the death of Christ that we need to meditate on. Explain that, if you might.
Well, let me preface my comment by saying, even though I have taught literature for half a century, I was not as aware as I was after doing the hymns books on the degree to which poets compose by stanzas. Every stanza has its duty to perform. I'm looking at my explication right now. I did not know until I subjected When I Survey the Wondrous Cross that the whole poem is built on the principle of comparison. The cross of Christ is compared in successive stanzas to the richest gain that we have, all human things that charm or claim our loyalty, other displays of love and sorrow. Christ's crucifixion was greater than that. And in the fourth stanza, the whole realm of nature. In successive stanzas, the cross of Christ is said to be superior. Now, it takes a words-only text and an ability to slow down, because we're reading the text, to see all of that. That was the great discovery I made. So much is present in a text, in a hymn text, that we don't fully realize when we're rushed along by the music.
And again, maybe as we were just joking off the air, as maybe why we don't have as many hymn writers today, we don't have as many good poets. And when this hymn was first published, the reference was to Galatians 6:14. Far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I the world. So just a very significant connection there with another one of the very significant hymns by Isaac Watts. And like you said, when you see it written for the first time, you begin to say, oh, I've always sung that, but I haven't thought about it. For us old guys, Dr. Ryken, sometimes we read through a passage in Scripture and we'll say, I must have read that 20 times. I never saw that. And there's a sense in which your book takes us through some of these hymns that may be familiar, others which maybe we've never heard of before, and helps us to understand some of the great strengths and teaching there as well. Another one by Isaac Watts, Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed, also gets us into the whole issue of the crucifixion. But I thought it would be fun maybe to jump ahead a little bit to one by Fanny Crosby, because oftentimes when we think of the great hymns, we think they came from the 18th century. She, of course, lived in the 20th century. But here, Jesus Keep Me Near the Cross. Again, you say that for at least two reasons, the image of the cross is prominent in nearly every famous Good Friday hymn. First, the events of Good Friday centered around Jesus' crucifixion, and Good Friday hymns overwhelmingly transfer our thoughts and imaginations to the scene of the cross. But second, the cross symbolizes the salvation that Jesus secured through the substitutionary atonement made on the cross. So in a sense, she's trying to help us not only focus on the cross, but what happened because Christ died on the cross. Explain that if you might.
Well, you're right about the theology of the hymns. Poetry is the voice of human response to a subject. So yes, many of the hymn writers begin by what earlier centuries called composing the scene. That is, they make sure that in our imagination we're present at the crucifixion, for example. But poetry is the voice of response to that, so that there's a meditative element that grows out of contemplating Jesus on the cross.
Very good. And again, I'm going to keep moving because there are, first of all, so many hymns and so many sections in the book, which brings us to the whole section on Easter, because we've looked at, first of all, the New Year and Good Friday, but then, of course, Easter. I would have to say, without a doubt, Dr. Ryken, the most famous is hymn that we sing on Easter morning, Christ the Lord is risen today, Charles Wesley. Now, if there's any hymn in this book that many people say, well, I know that one, I can't even count the number of times we've sung that during Easter, but then you take us through an analysis of the Charles Wesley hymn that we sing at Easter, and there are some opportunities when we see it in the written text that we probably miss when we have been singing it, maybe even by rote, every Easter morning, right?
Yes, and I want to say about my enterprise, it succeeds to look at the hymns as written text because we're not rushed along by the music, and that's huge.
Yes.
I would compare analyzing the hymns as I do, explicating them, I call it, to analyzing a Shakespearean play. And then in turn, singing a hymn would be like going to see a Shakespeare play performed. How much of what I uncover when I teach a play in the classroom is available to me when I see a Shakespearean play performed? My answer is no more than 20%. That's not a reason not to go and see a performance of a Shakespearean play, but compared to what's really there, when we can concentrate on the words, the singing of a hymn or the seeing of the Shakespeare play is, compared to that richness, somewhat thin. That's not a reason not to sing the hymns. It's just that we need to acknowledge the need to complement the singing with the experience of them as poems. I wanted to insert a historical point. Until the 1870s, hymn books were words-only anthologies. They were 5 inches by 3 inches, words only, and then beginning with, availability of music in the church that changed, but it's a way of saying I am trying to revive an ancient and venerable tradition.
Wow. And your illustration of Shakespeare is perfect, because any of us that have ever watched a Shakespearean play, or even when they've put some of them on television or in the movies, most of it just comes flying by. And because my producer has played in many Shakespeare plays, and he'll rattle off something and go, I missed that. I didn't realize that. There is a sense in which that is the case. How many times have our listeners sung Christ the Lord is risen today? But if they went through even just the 4 stanzas that you have there and begin to break it down, they will see the value of course, what you have done. And as you point out, it used to be that these were not put to music and were meant to really begin to understand these in a very different sort of way. So that is certainly the case. But I thought we would also real quickly maybe focus on one other one, and that would perhaps be the whole Reformation Day. A mighty fortress is our God, because, again, Martin Luther is known for the German Bible, known for Lutheran theology, known for a number of things, but he's also known for that particular hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, as you pointed out just a minute ago, obviously pulls out some of the ideas in Psalm 46, but it's more than just a paraphrase, isn't it? It is.
It is rightly known as the battle cry of the Reformation, because it has that sense of the conflict going on, and the hymn text just does a great job of taking us back in our imagination to the combat going on at the time of the Reformation. I will have to say, Reformation Day is an important part of my religious heritage. I do not know how many of my readers would have that as a category. The publisher fell right into line with it and agreed to it.
Well, and again, we may come back and talk a little bit more about that, because you have a number from Timothy Dwight, of course, as well as, of course, Martin Luther and a number of others. So we'll get into that, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. And if you find yourself saying, all right, I've never even thought about looking at the theology of these hymns other than some of the things we sometimes do at Christmas time, this book is available. It came out last month, and again, P&R Publishing is available at your bookstore, but if you have any difficulty finding it, we have a link on our website as well. Keith Getty said, a foundation of powerful and beautiful hymns is essential in the development of a community of believers and the expression of God's goodness through their lives. Thank you, Dr. Ryken, for this resource for the church. And so we'll spend some time talking about some of these hymns when we come back. And let me open up the phones. Maybe you have some thoughts about the importance of hymns in the church and in worship, and maybe you have some insights that you'd like to add to the conversation as well. So let's open the phones. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Leland Ryken with us as we talk about 40 favorite hymns for the Christian year, a closer look at their spiritual and poetic meaning. All that coming up right after this.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Leland Ryken. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. 40 favorite hymns for the Christian year, a closer look at their spiritual and poetic meaning. We were talking about Martin Luther just a minute ago, Dr. Ryken. Let me backtrack because there was another one there. Need to do this for my Lutheran friends out here, if nothing else. Martin Luther, Christ Jesus lay in death's strong bands. Very helpful because 5 stanzas just packed full of allusions and illustrations of biblical text. Matter of fact, at one point you say, this poem packs so many references to the Bible into its lines that choosing just one passage as a retrospective seems somewhat meager in comparison. Then you give us 1 Corinthians 5. So it illustrates again that you can learn various aspects of Scripture, and there's a sense in which Scripture resonates from these hymns. But as you said, if you're singing it, you may miss it. But if you have the chance, as you do in the book, to look at it printed out in the 5 stanzas, you begin to see the richness of some of the hymns, in this case, that Martin Luther wrote.
Yes, and I want to add that some hymn websites print the great hymns, the scripture references in the margin, and it's just eye-opening to see how many biblical references there are in the typical classic hymn. Also, regarding my book, it was the publisher's idea, I did have a predecessor to this book, to end each entry with printing a Bible passage that is a good interpretive framework for the hymn or a parallel text. Initially, I did that just out of a sense of duty, but then whenever I go back and read one of my hymn books, the scripture reference at the end strikes me as kind of the appointed consummation of the whole thing. It's just so edifying to have that additional Bible verse.
So again, just some great opportunities to study that. And I might just say for just a minute, Dr. Ryken, that we have a fair number of people that listen to this program. They're pastors, they're Bible teachers, they're Bible fellowship leaders, they're small group teachers. And if you find yourself in some respects maybe while going through a particular passage, maybe teaching expositorily or whatever, you can go to the back of this book, for example, and then find the index to the scriptures. So if you were teaching on that particular section, then you could actually use that hymn to illustrate that. And you did mention your previous book, 40 favorite hymns in Christian life, a closer look at the spiritual and poetic significance as well of some of the other resources that are available. So let me just mention that there are quite a number of resources that we've made available as well. But if you'd like to join the conversation, I would certainly love to hear from you. So let's take a phone call along the way. We are privileged to have with us today Dr. Leland Ryken, and we'll head out to North Carolina first. Bill, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for taking my call.
What would you like to add to our conversation today?
No, I agree. Having now attend a contemporary church, where we don't have the hymns being sung like we used to. But speaking to my own condition, I was sharing that in my Bible I have a hymn written in there that I came across many years ago, and it speaks to my condition. And the hymn was written by Charles Wesley, and the name is "Depth of Mercy." And I've been reading it, seems like every day for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And like I said, it's my condition, and it's also, a call back to Christ. But yes, I love the hymns. They were always a favorite during the holidays. And then, it's just too bad we don't sing more of them and understand the words as I'm sure that's being addressed in Dr. Leland's book.
As a matter of fact, in just a few minutes, we're going to get into some of the Christmas hymns, too. Those are by Charles Wesley. But it is interesting how these hymns, even like scripture verses, really come back and minister to our souls. Right, Dr. Ryken?
Yes, absolutely. The great hymns would make a really good devotional reading. And I noticed that PNR in their promotion of the book floated the idea, begin the day with a great hymn. it works perfectly.
One other one that I thought we might talk about in terms of Reformation Day, since that is a section I'm so glad you included in the book, is one by Timothy Dwight. Now, having gone to Yale, of course, I'm very familiar with Timothy Dwight in that respect, and having studied the Second Great Awakening, that as well. But as you say, it is no surprise that many Reformation hymns are about the church. The Reformation was the church movement that changed the ecclesiastical landscape of the world. And, of course, Timothy Dwight lived in the latter part of the 18th century, but nevertheless, this theme, I love thy kingdom, is kind of about the nature and glory of the Christian church, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's about the church as a spiritual entity. Now, I was unaware of this hymn as a Reformation Day hymn, and I kind of nudged it in that direction, but it fits.
It does.
And my principle of selection for the Reformation Day hymns was that maybe the hymn was authored by a Reformation Day figure like Martin Luther,
right,
or it would rank as such because its theme fits perfectly. Now, in the case of Timothy Dwight, he has another claim, namely he was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. I did not know that. I had not been inclined to look upon this hymn of the church as a Reformation Day hymn, but it was really enriching to put it into that context.
Well, again, just to finish these off, and I'll take another phone call or two, 1-800-351-1212. We have these last two sections dealing with holidays, if you will. One is Thanksgiving, and we have, of course, We Gather Together. The author is unknown, and we recognize that. And then also this idea of For the Beauty of the Earth. And in some respects, we don't always think these at Thanksgiving, but they do sort of fit into that category of Thanksgiving. So share how those came together, because it's a short section, but it's something I'd never thought about in terms of various hymns that we could sing during that Thanksgiving season.
Well, therein lies a story. I agree with you. I have not been accustomed to understand fully what makes some of these Thanksgiving hymns. When I came to this section, I just went to the internet. I looked at lists of Thanksgiving hymns, and then a kind of canon formed. So then I had to set about the task of seeing why they are in the canon, and that was quite an education to me. Some of them seem not to be primarily Thanksgiving hymns. Well, they are not primarily Thanksgiving hymns. So then I analyzed why they made it into the canon. There are several in that section of my book that made it, I am convinced, on the strength of an opening line. We gather together, for example. Mm-hmm. Then the hymn kind of wanders, but my task was to make it fit, and that was quite revealing.
Well, again, 5 of those hymns in that section, which I'd never seen before. So, again, just another unique part of the book. Just before we take a break, let's take another phone call real quickly. We'll head out to Georgia, WAGP. Ray, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you for this show, and thanks to Point of View for everything. My first assignment in hymnology class with William J. Reynolds was to find all the scriptural allusions in Charles Wesley's hymn, Hark the Herald.
That's a task, isn't it?
Oh. And it was like, if I can remember correctly, it was somewhere north of 3 dozen.
Unbelievable.
Just incredible. And the other thing I want to say, yes, we do miss a lot when we sing it as opposed to studying it. But by singing it, we're able to memorize it, and at least in my life, I can go back and reflect on it later because I've got it memorized, and I can dissect it then. And in addition, I can pull it up, particularly when my dad was dying 2 years ago. It was great comfort to have memorized many of those hymns.
Very good. Ray, thank you so much for sharing that.
That's a great point about the memory. I hadn't thought of that. That then, in turn, is a good reason to sing the hymns and sing them often. I'm glad you made that point.
That is certainly the case. Ray, thank you for calling. And when we come back from the break, we'll get into the Christmas hymns. This is certainly familiar territory because some of you over the years have had to put up with some of my commentaries in which I've done kind of the theology of Christmas hymns. And this one is quite extensive, so we'll just pick out just a handful at most. But if you find yourself saying, oh, this is pretty interesting, I would certainly like to be able to meditate on some of these hymns and learn a little bit more about them. It's about 180 pages, and it is very well done, and it really causes us to reflect and focus on some of these very important hymns, some of which we have sung for years, some of which might be new to you for the very first time. It has an index of Scripture, so if you're preaching through or teaching different aspects of the Bible, this would be something that you could use to finish off. So these are some resources that are provided by an individual that we certainly have benefited from all these years, Dr. Leland Ryken. And so, again, 40 favorite hymns for the Christian year. If you find yourself saying, I can't find it in the bookstore, we have a copy and a link to it on the website. And we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Leland Ryken. Again, if you find yourself saying, I haven't found this book in my bookstore, and I would hope that you might, but even if you don't, we have a link so you can get it both in hardback and in Kindle, and it is just a great resource, and it's one that I'm planning on using because as I look through this list, I think you had 12 of the hymns in the Christmas category. I think I've actually done commentary on 8 of them, but even there you bring in some other great insights. For example, the one on Charles Wesley, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. I was unaware that even though it was written by Charles Wesley, it was pretty much unknown until this 21-year-old Baptist preacher by the name of Charles Spurgeon brought it to the public eye. Did not know that. And even as I do a kind of a brief theological analysis of that hymn or many others, most of the time I'm focusing on the content. And yet here, even to use this one as an example, you talk about it being kind of a 2-stanza hymn, and the second half is more of kind of a petitionary prayer. So there's a lot more that can be added in terms of the structure and the style, as well as the content. And that's one of the things as an English professor you bring to this book. And a good example of that can be found in this very famous Charles Wesley hymn.
Yeah, my area of expertise is literary analysis, and this has been a pioneering effort because the hymns are not regarded as great poetry. While they are, they meet all the criteria of the poems I teach in my literature classes day in, day out. We live in a day of revisionism. All of the old interpretations of texts are said to be incorrect. Well, I'm a Christian and a traditionalist. When am I going to have my fun at revisionism? Well, there's a degree to which there is a revisionist agenda in my books. I am challenging a kind of assumption that these aren't poems. Well, they are poems. So it's been really a great experience for me to find this niche.
Well, I think you've done a very good job. Of course, one that is not necessarily a Christmas hymn, but a song of Christmas, Joy to the World by Isaac Watts, is another one that comes to mind because here it's to reverse the effects of the fall. Well, that did not happen with the first coming of Jesus, but will happen with the second coming of Jesus. And in some respects, again, bringing together some of the other ideas that are being expressed, and of course some of that pulled out of Psalm 96, let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice, let the sea roar and all that fills it, let the field exult and everything in it. One of the things I appreciate, Dr. Ryken, is just the fact that many times you'll put a verse in there and I go, oh, I should probably read the verse before we sing the hymn. So if nothing else, that's going to change the way we actually sing some of those hymns, even in my own Sunday school class.
Well, that's great.
Let's, if we can, also get into another Charles Wesley one, which is perhaps even more famous, Hark the Herald Angels Sing. And this one has multiple stanzas and is just, again, one more aspect of some of the allusions to what is actually found in the Scriptures. The verse that's used there is 1 Timothy 3:16, but nevertheless, just again, the fact that this was inspired when Charles Wesley heard church bells while walking to a London church on Christmas morning and caused him to write a hymn that we sing all the time at Christmas, don't we?
Yes. If I can say regarding the composition, when I put on my agenda a given hymn, it was just a journey of discovery then to learn the lore surrounding these hymns. It was so interesting. Hark the Herald Angels Sing, Whitfield rewrote the original line as Charles Wesley had it. He had a reference to Lo How the Welkin Rings. And every hymn really has its interesting backstory, and it was so much fun to compose these two hymns books.
Yes, certainly. One other one I might just pick out before we're finished. It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, Edmund Sears. That's an interesting story there as well. And so, again, some of these just have, and of course, Silent Night and a couple of others. But since we're coming to the end, I thought maybe we'd just talk about these books and how people can use them. You've already heard me suggest to some of our listeners that maybe pastors, Sunday school teachers, maybe even worship leaders, to give a little bit more of the backstory, but also to really take the time either before you sing it or after you sing it, or to use it maybe in a sermon to pull out some of the great theological truths in these hymns, which, as you said, when we sing them, we're lucky if we pick up 20%. So there is some real value in doing, if you will, an exegesis of these hymns, just the way we would do an exegesis of the Scriptures, don't you think?
Yes, that's a good image, exegesis. I had not thought of it that way, but that is what I do. I would also commend my book to the ordinary Christian who wants to read it as an anthology of devotional poems. I don't want that use to be missed. And I give a guide to each one, so it's just there for the taking. The hymn, words only, focus on the words and on the images, and on the verbal beauty. The hymns that I explicate are not as complex as the poems I teach in my literature classes. They're akin, but they're not as complex. Their virtue is the verbal beauty and the well-turned phrase. It's as though it just fell like a benediction on these hymn writers as they composed.
And you gave me another idea, and that is for people that are looking for a morning devotional. This would certainly fit. It is published by P&R Publisher, and again, you can probably find it at the local bookstore, but you could even order it at P&R Publishing. And of course, we also have a link there so that you can find it both on hardback and Kindle. You might want to get the previous book, and those are some great resources that just help you understand a little bit more about some of these great hymns. And so, if nothing else, Leland Ryken, it is always a delight to have you on the program, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you.
We need to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, let me just give you a little bit of a sense of what we're going to be talking about. Marjorie Dannenfelser will be with us. We're talking about her book, but also, of course, as an individual that has been a pro-life advocate, I'm sure she's going to have a few comments about the opening now on the Supreme Court and what that might mean for the future and the possibility of overturning Roe versus Wade. So that will be a conversation I'm looking forward to having with her. We have Greg Laurie with us. We'll get an update on this incredible kind of virtual conference that they put together, and just an incredible evangelistic outreach as well. Ron Smedley will be with us. We'll be talking about the fact that it's also Recovery Sunday, so we'll get into some of those issues, and so it'll be just a great opportunity to focus on a number of different topics. As we go through the week, of course, we also, as I mentioned, have Dennis Prager with us on Thursday, and I find myself quoting from him quite often. And of course, he's been in studio with us. So those are all resources that are available to you at our website, pointofview.net. I hope you'll be able to join us for the 2 hours tomorrow. Let me, as I mentioned, what is available on our website today. We have the piece by Kelly Shackelford that appeared in Newsweek, America Can't Afford to Wait for a New Supreme Court Justice. Also one by Charles Cook, Court Packing is a Silly Idea and the Senate Knows It. And my Viewpoints commentary today is entitled Racial Disparities. I point out the fact that sometimes when we have racial disparities, it might be due to discrimination or bias. Sometimes it's not. And so I wanted to help you understand that just because there's maybe a difference in the statistics between African American and Anglo American, between black and white, doesn't necessarily always mean that that is racial. That is the tendency today on a lot of university campuses, but I wanted to try to address that as well. And of course, we have our iVoter Guide and so many other great resources available on the website. We'll be taking down our banner on Truth Team, but if you still like to click on that and help us out, that would be greatly appreciated. But if you didn't hear at the very beginning, we did actually have a very good Truth Team week last week. And once again, want to say thank you to those of you that participated in that. Also want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.